Thanks, Drew. It's so good to see so many of you, some names that I know, some old friends from all over the world. I see Thailand and Philippines and the Ukraine and Seattle, California, Boston, Texas, New York. So it's so great that we have such a good group from all over the world. So let's get started. And I'm going to start with exactly what we're going to cover today. So the 4C approach, what exactly is the 4C approach? Some of you may already be familiar with it, but the 4Cs are communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking. This practice or approach really grew out of the K-12 system. And it's really about moving away from that drill and kill kind of educational system to really focusing on building skills for lifelong learning and giving our students those critical thinking skills they need to be able to go beyond where they're at that moment. Again, focusing on lifelong learning. And it's really a result of who our learners are today. And so that's going to be my second point. I'll talk to you a bit about who our learners are and why the 4C approach is so important for these learners. And lastly, I'll focus on each one of the 4Cs and how we can meet those in an EAP classroom. So I alluded it to already, but who are our learners today? Well, many of them are digital natives. And this 4C approach is often referred to as transformative learning or a building block for lifelong learning. It's really about those aha moments for our learners. And so just kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we work through these 4Cs. So as I said, this practice or approach, it kind of grew out of the K-12 system, but it's really focused on who our learners are today and how they learn differently than learners 10, 15, 20 years ago. You know, we find ourselves preparing students for a very unknown future. Many of the jobs that will be there in 20 years are not here today, just as jobs that are here today were not there 20 years ago. So this proliferation of technology has drastically changed how students learn and even how we teach. And alongside with this is the fact that technology is making our world smaller, right? And the skill sets that we're preparing students for today aren't the same that they were being prepared for years ago. So just think about education and think about ESL teaching, if you've been involved with it for a while, what it looked like 10 years ago, what it looked like 15 years ago, what it looked like 20 or 30 years ago. And it was very teacher dimension oriented, right? It was very focused on the teacher. Well, this 4C approach is really a pedagogical shift. It's moving away from being very teacher-driven to being very student-driven. Not anything new, right, in EAP and ESL teaching, but it goes much deeper than that. Okay, so it's focusing on these 21st century skills. And when I say 21st century skills, many people immediately think, oh, technology. However, it's just the opposite. 21st century skills are all about communicating, collaborating, critical thinking, and creativity. We've learned that students today easily acquire those tech skills, right? Many times my own students are showing me how to use the technology in the classroom. And these are very critical for academic success, no doubt. But these critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication skills go even further than that. They're very important for academic success, but they're very important for life success. And what we've learned is that they need to be taught, explicitly taught. And as I said, it's about giving students the tools they need to make these connections, to build this knowledge base, to integrate into whether it's an academic classroom or the workforce. So these 21st century skills, are very important, again, focused on lifelong learning. And terms like project-based learning really grew out of this movement for 21st century learning, having students critically think through each of the steps, having them collaborate. And I'd be amiss if I didn't touch on why we have this evolution. And I alluded to it already, but we have this population of learners today, the Gen Z population, sometimes called the iGen or the Millennial Generation. Technology usage is the defining characteristic of this generation. They're connected to their world through the use of technology. But let's think about some of the characteristics of this generation. And as I'm going through the characteristics, you might want to think about how these characteristics affect their learning. First of all, they need to be connected. They need to be constantly connected. There's zero tolerance for any kind of delay. They want instant gratification. They want instant feedback. And, I always use the example, think about a student who emails you and 5 minutes later they might come to your office, did you get my email? It's that instant gratification, the immediacy. They also like to have a role over content. They like to be content creators. Social media has made millions of content creators, and our students are included in that population. They also like accessibility. They want on-the-spot feedback, but they also want access to learning anytime, any place. And they're really accustomed to getting their learning in various ways. So not in a linear way like many of us learned, but very random. They like adaptive learning. They like when they're doing things to get immediately tailored feedback. And, we're seeing this on the pedagogical front with adaptive technologies and things of this nature, which are tailoring classes around these students. They use a multitude of ways to communicate, to connect. So they're deeply engaged and they're multitaskers. They want content that is very vibrant and they want it presented in a variety of ways. This access to social networks, to friends, to content. Teaching and learning strategies really have to take all of these things into account. And so when we're thinking about how we can successfully implement this approach, we have to know and understand these characteristics. And you could probably imagine with some of these characteristics, the things that would be successful in the classroom and the things that may not be successful in the classroom. So now that we understand a little bit about what the 4 C's actually are and who our students are, let's think about how this approach works. Well, this approach really focuses on building those higher order thinking skills as well as those affective domains. And when I talk about affective domains, I mean things like collaboration and communication. Can our students negotiate meaning? Do they understand different registers and the language they would need for each of those registers? Affective domains, they're becoming just as important as cognitive domains. But we also need to give these students the academic skills they need. So we have this generation of learners who crave immediacy, instant gratification, content creation, and collaboration. So I'm going to explain more how we can exploit the 4 C's so that learning takes place and that these learners are engaged and that they excel in learning. So we're going to do this by breaking down each one of those 4 C's. So let's start with communication. Communication, in its simplest definition, is the transformation of information, right? So this might be your feelings, your thoughts, your attitudes, what you know. When we think about EAP learners, we need to consider not just these traditional definitions of communication, but the communication they need for academic success. They need to be active listeners, right? That's part of the communication process. They need to be effective writers, again, part of the communication process. They need to be able to negotiate, and they need to be able to explain things, restatement. As educators, we are constantly communicating with students. We impart information, we give directions, we ask questions, we listen to responses and questions. So there's a lot of teacher to student communication. But to maximize these skills, we really need to build upon them a little further. And so we can do this by breaking down teacher communication and student communication. So when we consider teacher communication, a very, very important aspect of that is vocabulary, right? Of course, we want our students to understand us, but we also want to challenge them. We can do this by actively seeking out opportunities to increase their academic vocabulary, right? So we have to first think, what do we know about academic vocabulary? Well, three really important things have come out of the research. One, their academic vocabulary is a determiner of academic reading skills. Okay, so the stronger their vocabulary is, the stronger they're going to be as academic readers. It's also a determiner of their success beyond EAP courses. The stronger a student's vocabulary is, the more likely they are to be successful beyond EAP. And students with greater vocabularies also have higher confidence in language learning. And as language teachers, we know confidence has a lot to do with language learning and taking risks that need to be taken. So we have to think, are we exposing students in high enough volume to academic vocabulary? Are we building the support and scaffolding they need? So vocabulary goes beyond those traditional text exercises. And to do this, we should really look at, what does it mean to know a word? So Paul Nation, a great researcher and thinker on academic vocabulary and vocabulary in the ESL and EAP world, says that to know a word, a student needs to know the spoken form, the written form, the parts of the word which have meaning, the knowledge of the form and meaning, knowledge of concepts associated with the word, knowledge of vocabulary associated with the word, knowledge of grammatical functions of the word, knowledge of collocations, and knowledge of register and frequency. So to really know a word, you have to know a lot about that word. And so for effective communication, EAP students need to be not only introduced to the word and the word reinforced, but we need to make sure we have activities that are designed for independent production of the word. So traditionally, when we introduce a word, we might do it through text. So this is a reading. The words are highlighted. To the side, we have a text box. And that's great for introducing a word. How about when we reinforce the word? These are just two ways that what I do in my own classroom to reinforce vocabulary, and those are my own students there sitting on the floor. One thing is the famous memory game, right? Concentration. So you put vocabulary word on one card and the definition on the other, have all the cards facing down, have students in the group play. Another way I like to do this is through Jeopardy. You can have a theme. So if your unit in your textbook has a theme, like discovery and invention, I would make categories, people, things, and actions. And under each category, a definition, and the teams must give a word. Obviously, you can be more challenging. Number one, the easier words, 2, 3, 4, 4 being more difficult. So the team would say, we'll take people for 1. And the teacher would read a person who invents something new. And this team might come up with innovator. So these are great ways to reinforce what's in the text. But again, what we're doing or not doing here is allowing independent production. So for independent production, there are several things that can be done. Surveys are great, and surveys could be built in as a project for the class or project for small groups, where I might focus on a theme and have my students go out and survey. So they're going to be asking students on campus with those vocabulary items. Then they're going to be coming back and reporting on those vocabulary items as well. Free writing is a great way for students to use the words in a very low risk manner as well. So I might put a free writing prompt, have my students write on it for 10 minutes, and sometimes I even direct them, I'd like you to try to use these words. Impromptus, and I have an example of impromptu here. I use these a lot in listening and speaking classes. So I put my students in groups of 3. Each student has a role. They'll take that role one round, and the next round they switch the roles. But one would be a speaker for 3 minutes, one would be the timer, one would be a questioner. I make the questioner reframe what the speaker said. Again, a very important skill, 21st century learning skill, being able to listen and restate what somebody else has said. And here's just one example, and this is a high intermediate class, but what could be done to make this city more sustainable? And they had to use words like civic, legacy, and synergy. Great ways to get the students independently producing the vocabulary in a very low risk situation. And then task-based projects and collaborative tasks. Surveys could serve as one, but having students create a city plan, for example, if I'm working on this same unit, and having to do a presentation. And we'll see some examples of that in a minute. Now, what about student communication? What do we need to consider? Well, first, to prepare students for the 21st century, we really need to think about the opportunities that we're creating for students to communicate with each other. What are we doing to prepare them to go beyond their EAP courses? These opportunities really have to be explicitly planned for. And so it's important not to forget that 10-2 rule. So for every 10 minutes of learning input, which is teacher lecture, video, reading, there should be a minimum of 2 minutes of processing. Remember, this generation, right? Instant gratification, accessibility. So their attention spans are very, very short. So this concept of chunk and chew, like micro learning, giving learning in small pieces and letting students kind of chew on it for 2 minutes. That might be them doing some kind of pair or group activity, some kind of application of what has just been done. So you chunk the new concepts, you structure, and then let students process it in some way. It could be a free writing, it could be a journal reflection. Think, pair, share are also great ways to build this student communication. Another effective way to do this in an EAP class is by providing a very specific prompt for structured interaction. And so, especially in my lower level classes, I like to give my students roles. I like to assign, as you saw with the impromptu speaking as well, I like to assign roles. It helps keep it a little more organized in the classroom. And some learners are real hesitant to talk, right? So a guided dialogue can be very beneficial to help them break down and really chew on this new content. As many of you probably know, if you tell the students, okay, discuss this, it's really very unsuccessful in most EAP classes. It's very open-ended, and this is where students usually aren't as engaged or aren't on task. But I found that if I give students sentence framers and again, roles, this really helps build their communication skills and they're really on task. So I like to create roles like maybe a questioner, somebody who provides an answer, a reframer, reporter. These are simple roles that you can create when you do group activities. And ideally, students would rotate after each little micro lesson. So here's an example up here where student 1 is the questioner, and this might be in a writing class where they're looking at topic sentences. Why do you think this is not a good topic sentence? What could we change it to? Student 2 then is giving their opinion. Student 3, so you don't think it's good because they are the restater. And student 2 would say yes, and student 4 would report to the group. So a lot is going on in that short little dialogue. Everybody has an important role, but we can see a lot of those 21st century skills built into that very, very short dialogue. So communication, it's about building teacher communication through making sure that we're well aware of the academic vocabulary we're bringing into the class, but not just that we're aware of it, but we're creating opportunities for students to produce that independently, not just introduce and reinforce vocabulary, but creating opportunities for independent production. With student communication, it's very important that we also create opportunities for students to communicate with one another, to set up scenarios that they will encounter in their EAP classes. So let's move on to collaboration. First, it's really difficult to separate communication and collaboration, and actually communication goes through all of these, there's no doubt. So they are definitely intertwined, but collaboration really goes beyond just working together. As our EAP students move into university courses, they're going to find out that working collaboratively is really a key to success in higher education. So again, we're focused on building these cognitive domains a lot, the remembering, the understanding, the applying, the creating. But we sometimes forget that we need to put our students, we need to integrate them into teams or groups, that we need to build those affective domains, which again, everything from negotiating to listening to showing respect to others people's ideas and values. And for this digital generation, it is especially critical. However, research shows that there is a lack of explicit instruction in this area in EAP courses. So how can we build this very necessary skill? Well, one of the most effective ways to build it is through task-based learning and project-based learning. Task-based learning requires students to demonstrate communication, but it also requires them to be flexible, to compromise, and to understand what it means to have shared accountability in the classroom, right? So these are all critical for success beyond EAP. And technology can really help us foster some of this collaboration. I know my own students, they have a WhatsApp group, and they collaborate on that WhatsApp group a lot. So collaborative tasks build positive interdependence, and they really create opportunities for students to apply learning in very low risk ways. And they can guide each other in the learning process. I tell teachers all the time, we need to make sure that students are owning their educational experience instead of us just delivering that educational experience. And I think that's where things like task-based learning and project-based learning are so important. So this is just an example from Prism Reading. And you see students are working on design, and here they have to work in groups, and they have to redesign a logo, and they have to present it. So again, they're going to have to be flexible because they have to negotiate. They're going to have to compromise because somebody may not get their idea. And there's going to have to be some shared accountability there. Who's going to take care of what? So before the task with task-based learning, teachers are really preparing them for the task, right? We might be building that background knowledge, building some scaffolding. During the task is where the learners are doing, right? They're focused on the planning, they're focused on preparing. And teachers would facilitate this process and encourage communication. We probably wouldn't focus on accuracy at this point, but we want students to build that collaborative task together. And then lastly, this is where language focus would come in, right? Whereas students are maybe practicing a presentation, there might be some analysis and practice and recording and offering suggestions. So giving students the opportunity also to reflect on their own progress in these tasks is very important as well. So we discussed collaboration and communication. And again, those two things are really more focused on those affective domains, although in language, communication is definitely a cognitive domain as well. But focusing more now on critical thinking and developing critical thinking skills. When we think about critical thinking, we can't help but to think about Bloom's taxonomy. And we also must consider thoughtfully moving from that remembering stage to the creating stage. We need to move students up that taxonomy, and that's what scaffolding in the classroom is really all about. So take a look at this activity. Again, something from Prism Reading here, but there's specific call-outs of critical thinking. And with those are tied directly those levels on Bloom's taxonomy. So this is a task where students would apply. Then the next one is where students would analyze. And the next one is students would evaluate. And then hopefully, you know, as teachers, then we would create as well. So building those critical thinking. What happens a lot, I think, is, you know, we do maybe the apply in class, but then we move those higher order skills outside of the classroom. We're often asking students to analyze, evaluate, and create outside of the classroom. And those are the harder ones on Bloom's taxonomy. So thinking about incorporating some of these higher level taxonomies into the actual classroom rather than moving it outside the classroom. So as I said, we also have creativity. This is our last C. So we generally don't think about fostering or building creativity in EAP classes. But again, let's think about who our students are today. They are content creators. They like to create. They live in this social media world. And so creativity is a huge part of who they are and where they feel successful. And when I say creativity, there are so many definitions of creativity, and I really like Brian Clark's definition of creativity. He says creativity is seeing the interaction of seemingly unrelated topics and combining them into something new. So not really new, right, for ESL students. It's what we do in their ESL classrooms all the time. We give them pieces of language, and we want them to put it together and create something new with that language. So creativity then is coming from, you know, many different sides and many different things that we need to consider. We definitely have to consider the level and the language groups. And we have to think about explicitly teaching structures and procedures for like brainstorming. These things become even more critical when we're trying to build that creativity. We have to be intentional about the projects we design and how students engage in those projects. We want to choose projects that not hinder their learning process, but just build upon their already known knowledge and foster that creativity they have with them. And so if we look at this task here, where students are collaborating and they're going to be researching an art form, they're going to be preparing a script for a 2-minute video, they're making arguments about the best art form. They can build in a lot of their own creativity through this. And You can see all the amazing things that our students might come up with. There's tons of other things we can do in the classroom that build their language skills, build their communication, collaboration, critical thinking skills, but also help foster their creativity and really speak to this generation that is constantly publishing and pushing content out into the digital world. So creating public service announcements. These are great for listening, speaking classes, pronunciation classes, because you're really focused on using your voice for meaning. And so having students create PSAs, then they can add music, they could add images, and students really thrive in that kind of environment. Illustrating a global history maybe of civil rights. Again, I used to teach at an art school, and so at the art school, students would love to go out and take photographs and use them in the classroom. So this is a really good way to do something like that. Having students film a documentary on a social issue. Having students redesign the school or campus. I had students once redesigned the school parking lot because they could never get parking spaces. But doing these kinds of things, they're building their language skills, they're building collaboration, they're building critical thinking, and it's allowing us to tap into their creativity. Again, thinking outside the box here with these students. Here are a couple more. Creating an interactive family tree with voiceovers from family members. I just had students do this not too long ago, where they wrote their family tree and then they had to speak as that family member would have spoken. And it was amazing. They did wonderful things with their voices, but they really focused on how they could use their voice to change meaning. And that was the purpose of the activity, and quite successful and quite creative. They developed a brand new invention. I've had students create an app, make your own app, create a sustainability plan for your city. So as you can see with some of these, you have to consider level, but there's many things we could do from the beginning to the advanced level, and really fostering that creativity. So putting these 4 pieces together can really lead to better learning. And not just better learning, but lifelong learning, preparing students for the classrooms beyond the EAP world. So I've seen a few questions in the box, but if we've missed them, maybe you want to type them in and I can answer some questions.
Thanks, Christina. And while people are typing in any questions they have, I want to direct their attention to this box on the screen. Here you can download both your certificate of attendance and the resources for this presentation. A lot of things that you referenced will be listed in the resources, so I highly suggest downloading that document as well. If you have trouble downloading or opening either of these PDFs, I suggest downloading the Adobe Reader program. It's free on adobe.com, and it's just the Adobe Reader. You should be able to download both of these very easy and read them with that. So we'll wait for some questions to come in. We got a question here. How can we adapt technology to EAP environment? Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. I think there's so much we can do with technology in the EAP classroom. I'm a big supporter and advocate of the flipped classroom. And so I believe in pushing content out in a digital environment, whether it be through your learning management system, Canvas, Blackboard, Moodle, but pushing content out that is very low on Bloom's taxonomy. So things like remembering and understanding, allowing students to watch a video lesson at home, and then the expectation that they'd come into class having watched that. And now we can move up the taxonomy, where maybe we do an activity where they can apply what they've seen at home. So just, students have to take ownership over their learning. And the first time a student comes in unprepared is usually the last time they come in unprepared, when they realize I needed to do this in order to accomplish this the next day in class. So I think that's a great question. But moving some content out into these digital environments and letting us use the technology rather than being used by the technology, I think is the way to go in the EAP classroom.
Great, thank you. We have one here. How can we prioritize vocabulary learning?
I know. I think vocabulary learning is one thing that gets swept under the rug a lot. I don't think we do enough with explicitly teaching vocabulary. I have a whole slideshow, and I think it's up on slideshare.net on vocabulary teaching and vocabulary games, moving from things that you can do to introduce vocabulary to how you can reinforce vocabulary to how you can provide students with opportunities for independent production. And so there's lots of ideas up on there on slideshare.com. And if you just type in my name, you should find a good resource there.
Here's another one. Could you elaborate a bit more on affective versus cognitive domain?
Okay, that's a great question. So affective domains are those things like showing respect, negotiating, what we might consider soft skills, what we might consider things like emotional quotient, right, rather than intelligence. But just as important as those cognitive domains. So cognitive domain, we understand something, we remember it, we can apply it, we can evaluate it, and we can create with it. So that's moving up that the IQ as opposed to the EQ.
Here's another one. How do you handle group assignments to ensure that everyone participates?
That's an excellent question and one I get all the time. So you may have seen, I definitely give all my students a role. So, you might be the questioner, you might be the note taker, you might be the reporter. I find when I establish the roles, especially at the beginning of the term, they understand the expectation. When I just say get in a group and you're going to do this, the expectation is not very clear to the students. So assigning roles is a very effective way to ensure that everybody's going to participate. Also, I have a few of my colleagues who I know they keep a score sheet on group participation. I myself haven't gone that route, but I do think it's something to consider. So your students know that they need to participate. I mean, sadly for many of our students, passing or failing, getting a good grade or getting a bad grade is all the motivation they need. It's not so much about learning. So, I can see how that's effective. But I think establishing roles and I do it very early on in the term. And then by the end of the term, I don't need to establish roles anymore. My students understand the expectation that is there of them.
Great. Do you have any strategies for keeping low-level students in mind when pertaining to the 4Cs, especially in a multi-level classroom?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a lot that you can do with the 4Cs in a low level class. The family tree project I did was with a very beginner level class, and it was an integrated skills class. And, having a model is very important at that level. So, with my intermediate to advanced level students, I don't usually model or have a model of any of the projects because I really want them to be very organic. But my low level students, I think if you're doing some kind of project-based learning or task-based learning, having a model for them is very, very important. We all deal with mixed level, even though you have beginners. If you have 14, you have 14 levels in that class. And so I think in the beginning, when you're assigning roles, just being very cognizant of the strengths and weaknesses of the group, so we set them up for success rather than failure, is really important.
Great. I think we have time for one more. Um, do you have any creative projects that would be good for advanced ESL students?
Yes, I think, and I'm going to slide back to a couple of these. Uh, for example, can we move that certificate? Thank you. Creating a sustainability plan for your city is something I used in my advanced class a couple of years ago, where they had to have something that was written. They had to go out and take pictures. They had to give a presentation. Those are great for advanced level classes. Developing a new invention, making an app, these are all great for advanced level learners. Redesigning public transportation, redesigning your school or campus, even the PSAs. PSAs I've used from level 1 to level 6. So PSAs I think are really across all levels.